Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I'm sharing a conversation that I had with executive coach and author John Schuster on leveraging your past in coaching, finding your strengths, and answering your call. Hello, John. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to start by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us your style of coaching.
Yeah, happy to say that, Natasha. Hello, great to be here. And so I'm John Schuster, and I've been that my entire life. I've been a coach for a long time because I got in leadership development quite early. When the industry was this big and it wasn't an industry yet, it was sort of a craft, and then it started to grow. So our little firm grew with it. We did a lot of facilitated workshops and all that for a number of years. And when coaching came along, we were well equipped to kind of fit into that. So that's what I do. I coach. I've written a couple books and had the fun of being one of Natasha's instructors at the Columbia program. So that was great. And she's been good enough to stay in touch for all kinds of good reasons. And so that's who I am. Have grandkids and play some tennis and try to be interesting to myself and fortunately healthy and working on my own level of awareness is always what I'm working on. My style of coaching would be pretty influenced by a lot of different schools. I would say that I've watched it develop from kind of what I would call classic coaching. Well, I wouldn't say that. I always have my own personality and style in this. Since I didn't start coaching till I was probably late 40s or 50, I already had a lot of points of view about how to go about this, Natasha. Well, I'll give it a name, actually. When I've done some workshops, I've called it depth coaching recently. I called it psychologically informed executive coaching. Wouldn't have called it that in years past. I got a psychology degree several years ago, Natasha, about 7 years ago now. So that's when I realized why I could use that term now. But it was always self-awareness based. It was never very problem-solving. Fairly intuitive, but I liked assessments, especially early on. I did assessments, still do a lot of 360 interviews and all that. Contextualizing is so important. But psychologically informed being self-awareness was always somewhat the goal, maybe the major goal, which leads to emotional intelligence, which leads to better leadership. I could do the strategic things, having done a lot of things on strategy and culture and even operations. I had a few things I could do. But I was mainly around culture, emotional intelligence, self-awareness being the key to both of those, and helping, I guess, narrative intelligence. I've heard Carol Pearson uses that in her book called Stories We're Living In, I think it's called, her new book. But it's narrative intelligence, how they can improve their story. The one that they're trying to live into is usually somehow impoverished or limiting them.
I really love that self-awareness focus because I think that when you really look at something, and we can try to put a framework on it, we try to put a strategy on it, but if people are not self-aware, if they're not working on that and trying to be self-aware and then later other-aware, kind of following that emotional intelligence, they're not going to be good leaders and they're not going to be good problem solvers. So I like that you're dealing with the actual cause and not the symptomology, if you will, of all these other things. And all those frameworks are great, but if you don't have self-awareness, you're kind of dead in the water, I think, with a lot of different things, from leadership on down to just regular being an adult.
Being an adult, yeah, being a mature adult. I agree, Natasha. And I like the symptomatology in terms of, by liking it, I mean I honor it and respect it, and it's always telling you something, you know. So because the symptoms have information in them that we can use, and then I will relieve short-term anxiety in myself and in my clients by going after some short-term problem solving with them, you know, and making some headway on some things that are hardly transformative, but are probably somewhat useful, you know. So I work with symptoms, but I had a colleague teach me years ago. She'd say, I can work with symptoms for a while, then I have to get to the real stuff. Yeah, and it was always somewhat disappointing when you couldn't get past symptoms with people.
And that's where I think that coaches who can acknowledge, like you said, there's the piece where sometimes we need to move through a framework, and that's what's valuable to the situation. And then other times, other piece where you kind of have to pivot and look within, which is a lot of coaching.
Yeah.
But I think also sometimes, especially people who are new to coaching or are scared to look within, they would rather just use these other things.
Yeah, and they're not used to it. There's a lot of, some of it is fear, but a lot of it's just bad or not having the skill and the practices of knowing what it's about. So, yeah, helping people take steps that direction, and they'll get scared when they find it out. I guess fear is a big factor in most of our self-awareness growth, because we're afraid of giving up something or finding something. But I tend to not think of it in those terms too much. Well, I use the word anxiety a lot.
Are there other frameworks that you have found to be particularly helpful, especially in the realm of leader development?
Oh boy, that's a good one. Yeah, I still use a lot of frameworks that I picked up. So I'll speak as a 72-year-old here looking at the field. Back in my 40s and 50s, I think, it probably got to be about right, 40s and 50s. It was sort of a golden age of leadership development in my mind, and that maybe it's still going on, but it felt to me like the 60s rock and roll or something, And so there's a time when there's just bursts of creativity in certain fields. Leadership development had a kind of a golden age. Remember I said I started off when it was a craft? I read one leadership book in 1979, Natasha, before most of your listeners were hardly out of diapers, I imagine. And it was a huge book. It was called, I think it was just called Leadership by James McGregor Burns. This is one of the frameworks. So I'm 29 years old. I'm working at the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm a head of training at a big region up in Chicago. And I'm supposed to be responsible for leadership development, so I was starting to pick up these books. And this book was a barn burner for me. It's like, whoa, this is important, because he talked about transformational leadership versus transactional leadership. Now, that's the first time I ever heard the word transformational used often. Now it's all over the place. It's kind of it's too flip. Oh, I'm having a transformation. It's a new thought. That's not a transformation. He was talking about mindset change. What is a mindset change? And he talked about transformational kind of being when there's the way I do shorthand on it. James McGregor Burns talked about politics a lot. He talked about Lyndon Baines Johnson versus Gandhi versus all these different leaders. Leadership is a process of influence. And when you ask people to act on principle and not worry about self-interest and what's in it for me, you're asking them to be transformation, because you're getting yourself out of your self-orientation. And when you're transactional, you're saying, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. And you're playing politics, and you're doing the give and take that happens in the natural world of giving each other favors and being a power broker. The interesting thing about that is the more you go up the chain, the more currencies you have for power brokering. Mm-hmm. And of course, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the great president, the great transactional leader, and he tried to be transformational too, many things, but the Vietnam War got in his way, or he got in his own way perhaps. But transactional is really useful for all kinds of things. And I'll watch my clients. So this is the frame, Natasha. Some of my clients are pretty good at principled. At least they're not bad. Doesn't mean charismatic. They're pretty good at bringing principle and asking people on behalf of the customer, on behalf of the team, on behalf of humanity. Let's do this, this, and this. And people will believe that they actually believe in that. And they like to be invited into something larger than themselves. That's all the inspiration that we look for every day. And it's nice to find it day to day at work in little things. But they're bad. They can be bad at transactional. I've had technical managers tell me, Natasha, I just want to do my job. I don't like all this politics. Well, politics is your job, because in the world of give and take networks and all that, you got to protect your people. You got to give your people favors. You got to help your team be protected and resourced. And that's a game. And so it's a both and the transactional work can serve the leadership work, or the principled work, the transformational work. It doesn't work the other way around. If someone's career oriented, and a careerist, and people can smell the manipulation after a while. Really good narcissists and sociopaths, by the way, are quite good at concealing that. but most of us are not. It takes a while before, if you're around a real, called Snakes in Suits was one of the books on sociopaths in corporate life. That's a frame that I read in 1979 that I will still use with my clients. Instead of giving them a 7-minute introduction like I did to you, I'll give them a little 2-minute thing, sometimes 1 minute, and I'll ask them to be better at networking, or I'll say, how can we get better? So then after I read that book, there were a series of frames that came in wonderful leadership books that helped me a lot. And then there were coaching frames built on top of that. And so I'm frame within frame within frame, and ultimately you forget them all and you just go out and do your thing. But you never forget them, they're always in the background. So those are the frames. That's how I started to use frames of leadership and then frames of coaching all the time.
I love that concept of the transactional versus transformational leadership. Or I shouldn't say versus. I should say the Venn diagram that can be those two things effectively. But you also made a really great point in that sometimes we see these people who are deemed successful by society because they're successful in a quantifiable way, but they're absolute monsters and they're not actually good leaders, but they had this success and they may have just been transactional the whole time and kind of didn't get to that other piece. But then because they were successful for a long time, society held that up and they were like, this is what a leader has to do. This is what someone at the top has to do. And they forget, or they don't ever really understand that leadership takes away any right or any inclination you should ever have to abuse someone else, right? To treat anybody else like they're less. Even today, I will still hear people talk about oh, well, this person did these things. And it's yes. And in 1955, that worked. But now we live in a different time where your business is not your own business. It never can be anymore, not with the internet and social media. But also too, people are more aware of how they should be treated by their leaders. And I think that's good for everybody. It holds leaders more accountable and it lets people stand up for being treated appropriately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right, Natasha. One of those frames I got in the golden age I was telling you about was servant leadership. And servant leadership was that wonderful book by Robert Greenleaf.
What I've noticed about them is they never ask for something for themselves. It's always something for somebody else or for someone else or for this purpose. This is very other driven. But I think that's also interesting with leadership because you have to work hard to get to a certain place. And there's a little bit of you want to be humble, but there's also a little bit lack of humbleness that you need to get to a certain place. So what are your thoughts on that dichotomy where it's I need to promote myself to be in a leadership position to help more people, but I also don't want to talk about me all the time?
Yeah, sure. That's a great paradox. Lots of paradoxes when it gets to leadership. And it's the human mind. The human mind creates these dichotomies. And then when you try to put them together, they seem like paradoxical. Oh, less is more. Oh, wow. And so it's only because we kind of split things apart first, and now we have to try to put them back together in some kind of way. And paradox is a good way. So your good question is, that's that same frame I was giving you is, I can tell sometimes my clients were afraid to use their power. They were afraid to accept and use their power. Some, conversely, thought they had more power than they did, and I would warn them when I'm saying, better be careful. And you could, after you sense what the political environment is inside the organization, you can be of help to your clients on any of those questions that come up, or at least raise the question for them to consider. I think the game to play is building yourself the capacity to be able to be highly transformational, and that means build the side of you that's very altruistic and idealistic and wants to make a better world, and use the marketplace as a way to do that. That's why I put marketplace in my book, Answering Your Call, because most books on callings were about going out and starting an orphanage, and that's really a social good, but there's great social good that's created through these highly enlightened companies and great workplaces in the marketplace. have enough of an ego, a strong ego and platform to play the transactional game, the quid pro quo, I'll scratch your back. And sometimes that is being larger than life. So as long as you have a love of the goodness of humanity and what you can do about that, and the goodness of the planet and all species, right? And as long as you can say, I will play this game with as much savvy and cunning as I have to play it, but in the service of this, you'll make mistakes over here, you'll get beat up, and you'll get beat up on both sides, by the way. But I've taught several of my clients, you got to play it bigger than that. And I'd see clients who did not know how to raise their status and look larger than life. Once in a while, you have to look larger than life. I'm large and in charge. I'm big. And fill the moment, fill the room with bigness. Then, of course, have the humility to roll up your sleeves and be one of the folks. And if you can have that range of status, from high status to everybody's, I'm no better than anybody else, then you can play in that space. Don't get stuck at the bottom, and don't get stuck at the top. The top is the worst place to get stuck, because then you're back in high status, smartest person in the room stuff, and all that stuff that goes with that.
And I think also in being stuck in that, you never want to be the smartest person in the room. You want to be a smart person among smart people, right? Because that's how you get the best ideas.
Nice.
But whether you actually are the smartest or you're trying to portray that, it can inadvertently crush the people around you and you don't get the best ideas.
Yeah, and you might be the smartest for a meeting or two. I have told my clients who are really smart, I've told them to dummy it down. Otherwise, you'll shut off the good ideas and you won't grow their smarts. People are going to have to get used to they're used to you being the answer person. They're going to have to get used to you backing off of that. Let's go through a transition time when you can still show up smart when you need to, but also show up as an idea broker and stimulate and ask questions. I was thinking about this. What do you think? I'm not sure. You may have a lot of ideas about that, but get the other ideas first.
And I like to say that sometimes in leadership, and most of the time in coaching, I've never worked harder at doing nothing. Because sometimes it's like, I know what to do, like I have a solution, and nobody's life is in danger, so I don't need to tell them how to do it, right? I can let people work through it. And it's really hard in those moments to just kind of step back and be like, what do you think we should do? To suppress that ego and also kind of suppress that experience a little bit, just to be like, maybe this idea is going to be better, but also I never want to rob somebody of the lesson that they could learn in working through something, even if it fails.
Some people can't do that, Natasha. They cannot shut up because they'll see it as a game. They'll say, I got to be myself. I'll say, yes, you do. You certainly have to be yourself, but you want other people to grow.
And you had started to mention it, so it's a perfect segue for me to talk about your book, Answering Your Call. And in that, you did talk about common calls, such as the call to family or the call to scholarship, and then how they kind of fall on this grid. So with the head at the top, heart at the bottom, and then internal to the left and external to the right. So how can an individual take those beginning steps to answer their call to significance and use that framework?
I hope the framework is useful. I'm glad you remembered it for you, Natasha. Well, there's some people that are very action-oriented and love the outer world of go, make change happen out there, and they should do that. That's in their bones. That was me for many years. So those would be the outer calls, and you see it in external impact, and you can measure it in internal impact. Other people are more heady, or more introverted, or more thought-oriented, and they might be thought leaders, and so their impact tends to be more intangible. So that's two ways of thinking about that. The head and heart is the same way. We have these wonderful capacities as human beings, with our thinking and with our capacity for empathy and compassion. And so I've seen people looking like they're living their purpose and their signature life in both of those arenas. And everything's a Venn diagram, like you said, we're all combinations of these things. But that's one way for people to frame it, who've gotten, I think, underserved by the calling literature into thinking that it has to be some kind of service thing. Whereas the marketplace, you could get wealthy being a called leader. And that's a service of a type. I worry about the income disparity in our country. And, we got a little problem there that we can talk about it another time. But so those are the ways I think about it. The way you start all that is just with reflection. And I would say you start with seeing what are my gifts, and then how can I deploy these gifts wherever I'm at, day in and day out. And you'll come up with little bitty projects, and you'll come up with bigger projects and but the best place to look is what are your roles right now in life? I'm a parent, I got a job, I'm in a community. It's loaded with possible ways to make the world a better place. So start right where you are. And then some people have to, do the dramatic shift, and that's fine. I used to be whatever, and now I'm an artist or whatever. That can be great too.
And I appreciate too that you said, like, with it being this grid, you could kind of fall in different places depending on the project or depending on the type of call. Because I think there is a lot of pressure that society, and I hate to say society, I feel like that's such a silent army type of thing to say. But these pressures of it's like you find this one thing that you were meant to do, and then you do that thing forever. And I know that, like, when I went to college, my mom, she was like, you need to like major in curiosity and don't are you going to really like something when you're 50 that you picked when you were 18? Probably not. So to just be open to kind of where things take you. But also, like you said, sometimes you're serving and you're leading in a way that's through your family. And then other times it's through your work. And it can be in all these different places. So to not be like, this is the one thing that I do and I do it forever. It shows the space that there actually is for that in our lives.
Yeah, well, thanks, Natasha. And there's an ebb and flow to it. There's times when you feel really on your sense of purpose. There's other times, there's chapters in your life where you'll feel considerably off. I think, at least that's if my experience was true for others. But it is amazing occasionally when you find that person who at age 9, somebody told me this, I can't remember what field they got into, but age 9, they got, I forget what they were studying or doing, but they knew they wanted to be an X, and that's what they are today. And they are totally, that sometimes is a career and not a calling, but that almost always has calling elements. And so I always talk about job, career, vocation, calling. And Marcia Sinitar wrote about that. She called it levels of vocational integration. And the good news is at 72, I can say that because I've been working on it a long time, I do feel as integrated now as I'm in an integrated space. Let me say that. It forged a lot of stuff over the years, forged it, created it, forged it until, so now I'm in a decent place for me, always feeling somewhat like I'm missing it, but mostly saying, I don't have a do-over, so I'm just declaring myself a success, a calling success.
I know for me, I think I got your book at the perfect time because I was starting this transition from leaving the military and to going into the civilian world because I had just been unhappy and unfulfilled in my military career. The military is great. It was a great life. And it wasn't moving me where I needed or wanted to be. I almost needed something to tell me that it was okay to just be like, I don't want any of that. I just want to start completely over and do my own thing and do the things that I'm passionate about and that I'm good at. Mm-hmm. So I think that was really helpful for me in kind of making that transition as well. I liked being in service, but it had this other toll that it was taking on me because it was not something that I was called to do or that was in my strengths.
See, that's an important story right there, Natasha, is that you hung in there, you did your job, and you learned about what does work and what doesn't work for you. And then, but you didn't let yourself complain, but you kept on trying to self-express and find your gifts. And that's where I bet you where coaching showed up for you. And I was the head of personnel back when you didn't have human resources back there at the Environmental Protection Agency. I was at EPA for 7 years. And of those 7 years, probably 4 were I felt like, ooh, I'm on my purpose here. But there were 2 or 3 where I was wondering, what am I doing? And especially the last year where my job had become quite administrative and there wasn't enough room for me to kind of do leadership development. And, so I had to just kind of discard that and a scary moment, but a good liberating moment for me.
In your book, The Power of Your Past, you talked about these phases of remembrance. I really liked, I don't want to misquote it, but you were really talking about this piece where we kind of look at the past and we put this like beautiful sheen on it. And then it becomes this like knickknack that we kind of look at. We're like, oh, look at the past. And it's, well, like, is that how that kind of went? Or like, is this kind of something that we placed on it? In that book also, you had talked about the 3 phases of remembrance: recalling, reclaiming, and recasting. And so what does that look like, not only in coaching practice, but also in leader development for moving forward?
That's great. Well, thanks for bringing up those thoughts too. So there is a good time in your life, I think, many decades probably, when you're remaking yourself, you're reforging yourself from your early and adolescent years, and young adult too. You know, you're taking all these influences that are coming at you, and like education or gender or what race or religion or all these things come at you, and you encounter the world, and all of these things, all of these institutions or social forces provide you with some good, but they're also leaving you somewhat damaged, or at least limited. At least limited. Like the music world came at me, I mean, because I play guitar and sing now, but when the music world came at me, I didn't have any support for it, so it just went whoosh right through me. I appreciated music, but it's only been the last 20 years I've really played and sung and stuff. My wife bought me a guitar in my early 50s. So that's an example of a limit that happened. But there was also I had some damage with education. I was thought, like, I wasn't taught to work with my hands. I was in a college prep program. So we did not, that's what the other guys did. They went off and worked in the shop. I am going to go to college, and so I saw that was more damaging because I never, and mechanically, I wish I would have learned more. What happens then is we spend a long time, and I would say a couple decades, in a good way. It's not a bad thing, but it's kind of remaking yourself. Finding strengths, finding weaknesses, and then your aptitude. There's natural gifts that got evoked. I had a series of good English teachers. Those were wonderful pluses in my life. So my gifts start showing up. So your gifts show up and you're damaged. And so you got to take this inventory of yourself. It takes a long time. In the meantime, you're trying to make a living and maybe raise kids or find a partner or, so that life goes on. And it's not like you're debilitated. It's just that this inner work goes on. And many people aren't taught the reflective side of that work. I was deeply reflective and did it. It was kind of a natural place for me to be, but I can tell, there's some folks who just kind of live their life, and at age 50, you'll put a lifeline in front of them and some exercise. Tell me about your life. Say, whoa, how about that? I've never done that before. It's because you can go on automatic and just keep on, you can do that your whole life. So the book, Power of Your Past, was a way to say, go back into those memories and claim those positives. We can forget the very positives that we were built on. My wife is one of those. Music would have been one for me if I would have picked it up. My wife's done lots of great work on her natural gifts with rhythm and with somatic knowing. She really knows things through her intuition and empathy, and she doesn't need books. She's so good at just experiencing life and then knowing what's going on there. I need a book. And then you have to recast. So it's called recall, reclaim, recast. And the recast is, what are those limits in your past that you're still holding on to, that still have a hold on you that you're not aware of? And that's where that's one of those anxious places that you were talking about early on, the anxiety. Anxiety can come into those places where you have to recast because they feel like you're never going to make headway. They feel painful. And by the way, I think some people should leave some traumatic parts of their past there. They've learned to live with them and get by with them. But if you have had trauma, I'm always saying, go to a therapist. They can help you get through this. But most of us at least have some limits and damage that comes from those times. And that's what I like looking at. And most of our your clients will wake up in the morning and say, oh, what lessons from my past can I learn today? But they can sure tell you, wow, I just got a bad performance review and I'm a crummy listener. and I interrupt people, and that's a hard habit to change. Now, where do you think you started that? In your past. Why is that a hard habit? Why do you think you started that? Because at the family dinner table, you couldn't get a word in edgewise, and your family agreed that, or thought it was cool to kind of argue, and the loudest person could be there, and so you got these bad habits in the corporate environment that started way back there. So people don't wake up thinking about their past, but they do wake up thinking about their limits. And how do you find those? Especially the ones that are hardest to change, by reflecting a little bit on what can I do about this.
I love that because, like you said, we don't wake up and we think, oh, where did this start? Let me do this deep reflection. It's like, no, this is inconveniencing me and I'm triggered. And that's like,
I'm triggered, right?
So for me, like, leadership has always been something that's been really important to me. And I remember being like 7 years old, and I read this book about Dwight Eisenhower, who to this day, I'm still just like super into Ike. But that was actually something too, as I was kind of going through this like transition out of the military journey, that both of your books had helped me with, was when I looked back at like my leadership origin story, what did that look like? But it was like, why were these things so prevalent throughout my military career, and then other things that I'd done prior to the military? But like, why was that so important to me? And then how could I leverage those things moving forward?
Hmm. Oh, Natasha, that's a powerful, remember I talked about the 9-year-old, and for you now to be working in leadership because you read a book on Dwight that kind of blew your mind as a little kid, that's perfect. Those are origin stories of a major category. I'll give you a fancy name for that because that's what book people do. But that's an activation. So you were activated, and if you like there's certain kind of language that gets archetypal. Mm-hmm. So archetypal is a word that's kind of a big symbol, a big long-lasting symbol that's lasting all across the cultures and all through the ages. So if you're archetypically activated, you hit upon a kind of somewhere in the human realm of power, potency. Human potency is here, all with its ways of the Ike story was one that galvanized it for you, and then you have to pay attention to it. So good for you. I didn't read my first leadership book that knocked me out till I was 29. The notion that we can all be of service to others in every little interaction. And that's at the end of that book, Answering Your Call, I put a chapter on evocateurs. Can you evoke out of people skill and potential they don't know they have? And if it's just an interaction, you're walking down the street and say hi to somebody, or I went to the barista today and I have a nice little interaction with the barista, and then Patricia came in about an hour later and I was still writing away in the coffee shop, and I could hear the two of them, and Patricia's having fun playing with their names. It was Crazy Krista and Miraculous Mindy or something like that, So, but she's literally through her good mood and positive interaction. That's an evocative moment. You pull out of people just a little bit of positivity and that love energy, and we all have the opportunity all day long, unless you truly are isolated. And some people have found that space this last year with COVID, of course. But then you can do it with emails. Say good things. Pull out of people their best. That's a legacy right there.
Where can people find you to learn more about you and about any of your projects that you have coming up?
The website that I'm still using, and I was thinking about trashing it last year. I said, there's still some good stuff on there. Is John P. Schuster. Needs that initial, johnpschuster.com. A good email is johnpschuster@gmail.com. But those are the places to find me.
Thank you so much. This has been really awesome.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. All of the resources mentioned in this episode can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com, as well as timestamps to help you get right to the resource that you are looking for. On the website, you can also find a weekly leadership journal entry, a resource page with challenges and downloadable content, a place to sign up for my weekly newsletter, and an upcoming leadership platform full of workshops. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha, and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. If you'd like to hear more about a specific topic, please reach out and let me know. Join me next week for another episode.